That morning, the courtroom felt colder than it should. The air held the sterile scent of wood polish and tension, like even the walls were waiting to take sides. Cameras clicked somewhere behind me, their flashes reflecting off the brass nameplate that read, Judge Ruth O'Connor, my mother's friend. Of course, Councilwoman Elaine Rivers sat across the aisle, her posture rehearsed, her chin lifted with political grace. Beside her, Patrick Rivers, my father, avoided my gaze, as if guilt could be disguised as silence. Her attorney arranged documents with the calm of someone who already believed victory was inevitable. Then came the words that pierced deeper than any legal claim. This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve. That girl was me, the daughter she had ignored for years. Now the obstacle between her and the fortune my grandmother Jean Abbott had left in her will. It wasn't greed that chilled me. It was the ease with which she performed cruelty. The judge nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, and the lawyer smiled. That small, confident smirk of men who think connections outrank truth. But I had been preparing for this moment since the day I learned that justice in Redmond Hills often came with a price tag. My pulse steadied, my voice didn't shake. When I rose, the sound of the chair scraping against the marble echoed like the beginning of an ending. 2 words. That was all I needed to end the performance. Judicial disclosures. If you've ever watched someone twist family into a weapon, you'll want to hear what came next. Hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. Because what followed in that courtroom rewrote everything they thought they could control. Childhood never felt like the beginning of anything. It felt like waiting in a house built for someone else's ambitions. Redmond Hills was perfect on the outside, lawns trimmed, families polished. But inside our home, affection was rationed like an expensive perfume. My mother, Councilwoman Elaine Rivers, treated warmth as strategy. My father, Patrick Rivers, lived in the quiet space her ambition left behind. I learned early that silence pleased her. Approval came from stillness, obedience, invisibility. But Jean Abbott, my grandmother, never asked for quiet to love me. She carried sunlight into every room, smelling of cedar and lavender. Her hands were steady, her laughter unfiltered, and her kindness deliberate. She said, money should serve purpose, not pride. Jean founded a small community foundation that gave scholarships to local students. I used to follow her there every weekend. The walls were covered with photos of graduates she'd helped. They remind me why we're here, she once said. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Elaine and Jean shared nothing but blood. My mother saw generosity as weakness. My grandmother saw it as duty. When elections arrived, Elaine turned into a stage version of herself. Perfect posture, rehearsed smile. Speeches about family values she never practiced. Jean stayed away from those events, calling them theatre. Their distance became permanent long before I was old enough to choose sides. Jean never flaunted wealth, but she had plenty. Years of quiet investments made her independent in a way my mother couldn't control. That independence irritated Elaine more than poverty ever would. When the forgetting began, it was small, misplacing keys, repeating stories, losing track of days. At first, I blamed age. Then I learned the word Alzheimer's and the world tilted. I was 22 when Jean sold her big house and moved into a cottage at the edge of town. I moved in with her. My mother didn't argue. It was convenient for her campaigns. Those 2 years became my education in love. Jean's mind flickered like an old film, skipping scenes but never losing tone. Even when she forgot my name, she smiled as if her heart still remembered. She hummed old songs while I paid bills and cooked dinner. I learned patience from repetition, courage from exhaustion, and grace from watching her fade without bitterness. Elaine visited only when cameras did. She brought photographers, flowers, and false concern. The nurses whispered about how polished she looked, as if presentation equaled affection. I stayed silent because anger was useless against someone who turned guilt into branding. The final winter was the quietest. Jean spoke less, slept more, and held my hand longer. I found her old notebooks one night, letters, recipes, speeches she never gave. Among them was a sealed envelope labelled for Callie. Inside was a letter and a notarized will. She left everything, her estate, savings, and foundation, to me. She wrote that kindness had to be inherited the same way money was, or it would vanish. When she passed that spring, the house felt larger, but I didn't cry. Grief had been living with me for months already. I organized the funeral alone. Elaine arrived in black silk, greeting donors with camera-ready sorrow. Her speech about family unity drew polite applause that made my stomach twist. For a while, peace existed in paperwork. I managed to the estate, answered condolences, and began running Jean's foundation. Then an envelope appeared at my door bearing the logo of Keller and Associates, my mother's attorney. Someone had told her about the will. That evening, she arrived without warning. I remember the click of her heels, the tremor in the air when she saw the documents. The mask of public grace slid off her face, revealing something sharper than grief. Power doesn't mourn, it plots. In her eyes, I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was the mistake standing between her and control. That was the day I realized love in our family had skipped a generation, and the one who had cherished me was gone. What remained was the beginning of a war I hadn't chosen, but would have to finish. By early autumn, peace had become a rumor. The hills around Redmond glowed gold, pretending calm, while tension coiled underneath. My mother had found her rhythm again, not in motherhood, but in warfare disguised as politics. It began with whispers that grew their own names. Articles followed, dressed as compassion but engineered like traps. Daughter inherits fortune amid family concerns. Every line suggested manipulation. Each photo placed beside words like greed and betrayal. In Redmond Hills, rumor was currency. Councilwoman Callie Rivers knew that better than anyone. She crafted sympathy like policy, her smile timed for headlines. I didn't need confirmation. The fingerprints of her strategy were everywhere. My father called once, his voice cautious, asking if I could resolve things quietly. He sounded like someone bargaining with a storm. I ended the call gently. Grief was no longer my weakness. It had turned into armor. I hired Alicia Grant, a lawyer who's calm, unnerved people. She didn't offer comfort, she offered process. Her first instruction was simple: document everything. The goal wasn't to fight emotion with emotion, but pressure with precision. Soon envelopes arrived daily. Legal threats, demands, insinuations of exploitation. Each one tried to exhaust rather than accuse. My mother's campaign machine was operating perfectly. Drain the will before the trial began. Alicia built order from chaos. We created a log for every call, every statement, every piece of manufactured outrage. They want reaction, she reminded me. Give them records instead. Meanwhile, my mother smiled on television. Her campaign commercials dripped sincerity. She spoke about protecting family heritage and honoring her late mother's values. The same hand-signing motions against me gestured about morality to voters. Redmond Hills applauded her story. I became the contrast that made hers shine brighter. Reporters waited outside my office, pretending curiosity. The foundation's work was overshadowed by scandal that never existed. Through the noise, Alicia stayed unshaken. Facts, she said, age better than rumors. So we collected them. Old bank statements, donation records, foundation archives. The more we gathered, the clearer the pattern became. One name appeared too often to ignore: Judge Ruth O'Connor. At first I dismissed it as coincidence. The city was small, professionals overlapped, but Alicia found showing consistent personal donations from the judge to Elaine's campaigns, each one carefully below public reporting thresholds. Curiosity turned into certainty. I began searching through online archives, buried social posts, local news photos. Again and again, they appeared side by side at fundraisers, private dinners, charity galas. Their smiles looked natural, practiced, synchronized. These weren't glimpses of professionalism. They were evidence of comfort, connection strong enough to blur boundaries. My grandmother used to say, integrity doesn't erode overnight. It dissolves quietly until the reflection in the mirror belongs to someone else. That's what I saw in those photos. When public slander failed to break me, the threats shifted tone. Anonymous messages warned me to think carefully. A car lingered outside my gate for hours one night. Fear tried to introduce itself, but I had learned discipline from caregiving. Stillness under chaos. Alicia insisted we stay silent publicly. They'll use your defense as confession, she said. So we worked quietly, layering facts like bricks. My apartment filled with folders and timelines, every line connecting my mother's power to the judge's favor. It no longer looked like a home, but like a blueprint of corruption. Elaine's empire ran on control. Mine was learning patience. She had always won by being louder. I would win by being exact. Each document became its own verdict, each photo a mirror she couldn't escape. The final connection arrived one evening in a forgotten event archive. Judge O'Connor had officiated the opening fundraiser of Elaine's first campaign. Her signature sat beside my mother's on the sponsor list, the ink preserved in glossy print. It was small, almost elegant, and damning. I stared at the evidence under the desk lamp. The glow painted my hands pale, steady, deliberate. Somewhere between the fear and fatigue, a realization surfaced. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about exposure. For years, she'd built a machine that shaped perception. Now, the same machine had left a trail too intricate to erase, and the pressure she designed for me was starting to crush her instead. Morning arrived without promise. The sky was a pale sheet above Redmond Hills, its color indifferent to the storm moving quietly beneath it. Every battle needs structure, Alicia said. I took her advice literally. My living room became a war room, folders stacked like bricks, timelines pinned across a corkboard, photos marked in neat columns. I didn't need rage to fight, I needed rhythm. Each document felt heavier than paper. They carried years of my mother's entitlement, the fingerprints of a system designed to protect her. Councilwoman Callie Rivers wasn't just a mother defending pride, she was a public figure defending image, and image had rules sharper than law. Alicia Grant reviewed every file with the patience of a surgeon. She built our case piece by piece, turning suspicion into sequence. I watched her transform my fear into evidence, my memories into logic. The process numbed me at first. It demanded discipline, not emotion. While others lived their lives, I lived in records, tax forms, donation receipts, property transfers, social event logs. The monotony became its own kind of prayer. Between the lines of numbers, a pattern sharpened. Judge Ruth O'Connor appeared again and again, listed on charity boards, tagged in campaign newsletters, photographed at fundraisers hosted by my mother's committee. The connection was no longer coincidence, it was design. Elaine had always mastered optics. Friendship with a judge wasn't corruption when hidden beneath philanthropy. Every gala became camouflage. Every donation a thread in the same silk veil. The brilliance of her strategy was that it looked harmless, but paper doesn't lie, and cameras never forget context. I began collecting not just documents, but details, the dates of overlapping events, the sequence of financial filings, the repetition of names on guest lists. Each discovery was a brick in the wall Alicia wanted me to build, a barrier made not of anger, but accuracy. Outside, the narrative remained loud. My mother's public team continued its quiet theatre. Billboards, interviews, charity drives, all perfectly timed to drown any hint of scandal. She smiled beside children holding scholarships my grandmother had once funded, rewriting legacy into advertisement. Watching it felt like grief in a new costume. I stopped expecting fairness. Justice, I realized, wasn't balance. It was endurance. The more pressure they created, the steadier I became. The human body adapts. The human heart learns restraint. Alicia filed preliminary motions, anticipating the storm. Every draft passed through her hands until language became weaponry. She believed in precision the way soldiers believe in armor. "Let the evidence speak before you do," she told me once, and I understood she wasn't talking about court strategy, but survival. Nights blurred into quiet mornings, sleep became optional. I woke with ideas for cross-referencing files, checked timestamps, verified signatures. Fear had no room to grow inside routine. One evening, while arranging photographs chronologically, I noticed something subtle. The same floral arrangement on two separate event stages years apart. The sponsor lists were identical. Beneath the printed decorum lay a clear pattern of financial interdependence between the judge's charity and my mother's re-election fund. That small repetition, unnoticed by most, became the thread that tied everything together. Alicia confirmed it within hours. The records aligned perfectly. "This isn't influence," she said, scanning the papers. "It's infrastructure." She was right. What I'd uncovered wasn't corruption born from desperation. It was architecture built over years, steady and deliberate. It explained why every door I'd tried to knock on closed politely in my face. The network wasn't protecting my mother's innocence. It was protecting its own convenience. I realized then that the wall I was building wasn't just defense. It was containment, a way to trap the system that had cornered me. Each document tightened the space around their lies until movement became impossible. By late winter, our case stood ready. Alicia assembled the evidence into sequences even a biased mind couldn't ignore. I memorized every exhibit, every time, every name. When fear tried to speak, I replaced it with data. Somewhere in that discipline, the balance shifted. My mother's campaign looked flawless from the outside, but internally, her control was cracking. Anonymous resignations surfaced from her staff. Two sponsors withdrew their support, citing ethical concerns. Her silence grew louder, and silence was the one thing I had learned to read. The wall was complete, not of bricks, but of truth. So meticulously arranged, it could withstand anything built on pretense. And as the court date approached, I understood the quiet satisfaction my grandmother must have felt in every act of patience, because revenge, when built carefully, doesn't shout. It stands. The morning felt sterile, like time itself had been disinfected. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their lenses raised like weapons. Inside, silence had weight. The smell of varnished wood mixed with something colder. Anticipation. I took my seat, breathing in the stillness that comes before a verdict. Councilwoman Callie Rivers sat across the aisle, wrapped in composure too perfect to be real. Her lawyer, Brian Keller, arranged his notes with theatrical precision. Between them, power hummed like electricity behind glass. At the bench, Judge Ruth O'Connor looked poised, almost detached. Only I knew the fault line beneath her calm. Years of entanglement dressed as friendship. The air itself seemed aware of it. When the proceedings began, Brian spoke in the rhythm of manipulation. His arguments were rehearsed to sound humane, an appeal to morality, not greed. He painted me as misguided, too young to understand the responsibility of inheritance. Every phrase tried to shrink me into something fragile. I didn't react. Alicia had taught me the discipline of stillness. Let them exhaust themselves first. The hearing stretched like an elastic band. The clock ticked without mercy, each minute pulling tighter. I could feel the audience shifting, sympathy being molded by tone rather than truth. That was my mother's greatest talent, performance mistaken for sincerity. When her turn came, Elaine delivered what sounded less like testimony and more like a campaign speech. She spoke of community, sacrifice, and a daughter who lost her way. Her voice trembled at all the right moments. To anyone who didn't know her, it would have been moving. To me, it was choreography. Then it was my turn. I rose carrying the folder that had become both shield and sword. The room seemed to shrink as I walked to the table. The light above the judge's bench reflected on the polished floor like a warning. Facts don't need volume, they only need sequence. Alicia's voice echoed in my memory as I opened the first file. Each exhibit built upon the last, donation records, photographs, correspondence, every layer revealing the quiet network between the judge and my mother. No accusations, just alignment, patterns so precise they didn't need interpretation. When the final photograph slid across the table, the energy in the room changed. It showed Judge O'Connor standing beside Elaine at a fundraising podium, hands clasped, smiles identical. The image was harmless alone, but devastating in context. The silence that followed felt alive. Even Brian Keller's pen stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, the judge's control fractured. Her breath caught. Her hand trembled. Then, like instinct, she nodded, agreeing with my mother's earlier claim about my unworthiness. That tiny motion was enough. The mask cracked in public view. I didn't need to speak. The truth had spoken through posture, through reaction, through the small betrayal of human instinct. Alicia's motion for recusal followed the next heartbeat. The courtroom froze as the judge struggled to recover composure. But professionalism couldn't undo what the audience had already seen. Ruth O'Connor's ruling was swift, mechanical, stripped of confidence. She upheld the will, confirmed my inheritance, and dismissed all claims of undue influence. Her voice wavered through the closing statement, each word an act of damage control. Elaine's face remained still, but the stillness was different this time. It wasn't strategy, it was shock. Control had always been her religion, and I had just turned faith into evidence. When the gavel fell, the sound echoed like closure made physical. The reporters moved first, chasing quotes, chasing chaos. I didn't move. I watched my mother stand, her expression flickering between disbelief and calculation. That moment, the second she realized the narrative was no longer hers, was the quietest victory I'd ever known. The days that followed blurred together, stitched by headlines and static. The courthouse emptied, but its echo stayed. Outside, reporters turned fragments of my story into currency. Inside, the silence of victory felt too heavy to celebrate. Winning never sounded like triumph. It sounded like the clock finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. Judge Ruth O'Connor submitted her resignation within a week, citing personal health reasons. The statement was short, the consequences longer. The State Judicial Review Board opened an inquiry before the ink on her resignation dried.